My evil mother-in-law forced me to take a DNA test for my son to humiliate me, but when the results came out, her terrible secret was revealed. When I married my wife, I knew I was committing to more than just her. I was also signing up for her family, and let me tell you, if I had known what that really meant, I might have thought twice. Especially because her mother, my dear mother-in-law, came with the package. From the very beginning, she made it her life's mission to prove that I wasn't good enough for her little princess. Nothing I did was ever right. If I cooked, my seasoning was off. If I worked extra hours, I was neglecting my wife. If I rested, I was lazy. You just couldn't win with this woman. Things only got worse when our son was born. Oh, he was perfect. Everything good about my wife and me rolled into one tiny, beautiful human. But for my mother-in-law, his very existence seemed to offend her. She became obsessed with nitpicking every little thing about him. His hair, his complexion, his smile. She'd act like she was just making harmless observations, but the way she kept repeating them made it clear there was something else behind her words. The breaking point came during a family gathering. It was a typical Sunday barbecue. Grilled meats, endless small talk, and me just trying to survive the day. While I was pouring drinks, I heard something that made me freeze mid-pour. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that child isn't his. Look at him. He doesn't look like him at all. My mother-in-law said it loud enough for everyone to hear, like she was discussing the weather. Of course, my blood boiled. But what could I do in that moment? I wasn't about to create a scene in front of the entire family. I bit my tongue and tried to move on, but the damage was done. Later, my wife tried to reassure me, saying her mother just liked to stir up drama and didn't mean anything by it. But the tension was there, unspoken but heavy. Something had shifted that day, and it didn't stop there. My mother-in-law turned this into her personal crusade. Every time she called or visited, she made little remarks about how the baby has different features, or sometimes kids don't inherit everything from their dads. It wasn't subtle. It was relentless. I felt trapped. What do you do with a person like this? Confront them? Ignore them? Laugh off their bitterness? Nothing seemed like the right move. Then she made her grand move. During another family gathering, with all the dramatic flair of someone announcing a royal decree, she said, "For everyone's peace of mind, I think it's time for a DNA test." She smiled like she was being reasonable, but the words carried the weight of an accusation. The family, who had been quietly observing up to that point, erupted into murmurs. Some said it was unnecessary. Others thought it might not be a bad idea. And there I was, standing in the middle of this circus, feeling like I was on trial for a crime I didn't commit. My wife tried to calm things down, but eventually the pressure was too much. "Let's just do the test," she told me, with that look that said she didn't want to fight. I knew agreeing meant giving my mother-in-law the upper hand, but I also knew that refusing would just fuel her accusations even more. I agreed, but something shifted in me that day. It wasn't just about the test anymore. It was about something bigger. My mother-in-law wasn't just being meddlesome. There was something darker behind her insistence, and I was determined to find out what it was. That moment set everything in motion. I thought the worst thing that could happen was a bit of gossip, but I had no idea about the storm that was brewing. If my mother-in-law thought she could get away with this, she was about to get the shock of her life. When I finally agreed to the DNA test, I thought it would be the end of this ridiculous circus. A simple test, a few days of waiting, and we'd all move on. But, of course, I underestimated my mother-in-law. What started as a public humiliation during a family gathering slowly morphed into something darker, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. In the days following that dinner, my mother-in-law began acting strangely. Strange even for her. Maybe it was just my imagination, but she seemed more on edge than usual. She'd answer phone calls in whispers, step away to talk, and abruptly hang up whenever someone came near. A few times, I caught her looking at my son with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't just her usual disapproval. It was deeper, almost as if she were worried or even scared. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking things. But then something happened that made me question everything. One afternoon, while searching for some documents in her office, papers we had left there during a move, I stumbled across a thick envelope hidden among some old books. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than legal paperwork. But as I read through it, one name jumped out at me: Alfonso R. The name meant nothing to me, but the context did. The papers detailed a long-disputed inheritance within the family, involving properties and assets that had never been properly distributed. There were names crossed out, handwritten notes in the margins, and dates that didn't quite match up. What stood out most was that my mother-in-law's name appeared multiple times, almost as if she were working to secure a bigger share for herself. I didn't say anything then, but I made a mental note of that name: Alfonso R. Something didn't add up, and I was determined to dig deeper. Meanwhile, the DNA test was underway. My wife and I had already submitted our samples, but my mother-in-law wouldn't stop asking when we'd get the results. Her insistence was almost desperate. What puzzled me even more was how she wasn't asking us directly. She was bringing it up casually with other family members, planting seeds of doubt without confronting me head-on. A few days later, I received an unexpected email that sent chills down my spine. It was from an old acquaintance of my wife's family, someone I hadn't seen since our wedding. The message was brief but ominous. "Be careful with your mother-in-law. There are things you don't know about her past, and this DNA drama might just be a distraction." Suddenly, it all started to make sense. The DNA test wasn't just about humiliating me or casting doubt on my son. It was part of a larger game. My mother-in-law was moving pieces on a chessboard I didn't even know existed. If that email was right, the DNA test was just a smokescreen to divert attention from something much bigger. From that point on, I started watching my mother-in-law more closely. Her comments, her movements, even her silences, they all seemed calculated. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something big. The turning point came one evening when I decided to investigate Alfonso R. After hours of fruitless internet searches, I finally stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. This man had been accused of a major crime decades ago, a multi-million-dollar robbery and a murder. The case was never solved, and Alfonso had disappeared shortly after the crime, evading capture entirely. This revelation hit me like a freight train. How was this man connected to my mother-in-law? What did he have to do with our family? Why was she so desperate to distract everyone with this DNA test? Suddenly, her obsession with the inheritance, her strange behavior, and her need to discredit me all began to paint a much darker picture than I had anticipated. I realized I was caught in something far more complicated than I had initially thought. But if my mother-in-law believed I was going to sit idly by, she was in for the shock of her life. The days leading up to the DNA test results were a mix of anxiety and suspicion. Every time my mother-in-law asked about it with her fake tone of curiosity, it felt like I was being dragged into a game I didn't know the rules of. And it wasn't just her. The sideways glances from some family members, the tension at gatherings, even the uncomfortable silence from my wife. It all felt like something bigger was brewing, something no one wanted to say out loud. Finally, the day came. The envelope with the results sat on the dining table, practically daring me to open it. My wife was beside me, trying to act calm, but I could feel the tension in her hands as we opened it together. As for me, I thought I was ready for anything, or so I believed. The results confirmed what I had always known in my heart. The child was mine.
Biologically mine.
But the relief I expected to feel barely lasted a moment. The look on my mother-in-law's face when we told her the results was strange. She didn't look shocked. Disappointed, maybe? It was as if she had been banking on a different outcome, as if a key part of her plan had just crumbled. In any other situation, that would have been the end of it. But this wasn't any other situation. This was just the beginning. My mother-in-law didn't back down. Instead of apologizing or admitting she had crossed the line, she excused herself with a flimsy reason and left the family gathering entirely. Something wasn't right. If her goal had been to humiliate me or cast doubt on my child, why did she seem even more worried now? That night, as everyone else slept, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The name Alfonso R. kept circling in my mind, and my mother-in-law's behavior only made everything more suspicious. It was time to dig deeper. I stayed up late researching that name, scouring the internet for anything that might give me a clue. Hours into my search, I found something that made my stomach drop. Among a few scattered public records, there was a brief mention of an old case, a multimillion-dollar robbery and a murder committed decades ago. Alfonso R. had been named the prime suspect but was never caught. The details were vague, but what little I found painted a chilling picture. This man had vanished shortly after the crime, leaving behind a trail of questions and speculation. The next day, still processing what I'd found, I noticed my mother-in-law acting more cautious than ever. She avoided direct conversations with me and worked tirelessly to keep everyone distracted. Anytime someone brought up the DNA test results, she would skillfully change the subject, almost like a seasoned politician dodging a scandal. I knew it was time to act. I couldn't just sit back and watch her manipulate everyone. During a visit to her house, I pretended to have forgotten something in her office and used the chance to search for more clues. This time, what I found was far more disturbing. It was an old, yellowed letter, handwritten and addressed to her. The sender? None other than Alfonso R. The tone of the letter was strange, almost desperate. In it, he wrote about the truth that must never come to light and how everything must be kept secret for the good of the family. He even mentioned my mother-in-law directly, pleading with her to protect whatever he had left behind. Suddenly, everything started to click. My mother-in-law wasn't just obsessing over my son's DNA out of paranoia or a need for control. She was desperate to cover up something much bigger, something that could shatter the family's perception of her entirely. I took the letter with me, making sure no one noticed, and that night I couldn't sleep. If Alfonso R. was connected to my mother-in-law and if there was something he wanted to protect at all costs, what exactly was it? And why was she so determined to shift everyone's focus onto me and my son? All I knew was that this story was far from over. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. And while I didn't know where this would lead, I was determined to uncover the truth. Finding Alfonso R.'s letter left me with more questions than answers. While it was clear this man had a deep connection to my mother-in-law's past, I still couldn't figure out the full extent of it. Why was he writing to her with such urgency? What was this truth he mentioned? And why did it need to be protected for the good of the family? Most importantly, how did any of this connect to me and my son? I spent the following days analyzing every word in that letter. My mind kept circling around phrases like the truth and the secret. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was tied to the crime I'd uncovered in my earlier research. But how? Was my mother-in-law actually involved? And if so, how far did her involvement go? Meanwhile, her behavior became even stranger. She had gone from being the controlling and overbearing woman we all knew to someone reserved and, frankly, nervous. She now avoided any direct conversations with me, and during family gatherings, she kept herself busy steering conversations toward anything unrelated to the DNA test or my son. It was clear she was trying to divert attention, but that only made her seem more suspicious. One afternoon, I decided it was time to confront her. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stay in the dark any longer. I went to her house, letter in hand, ready to face her. When I arrived, I found her alone, which was unusual. She was always surrounded by family or friends, projecting her image as the perfect matriarch. I didn't waste any time. "I know there's more to this than you're letting on," I said, holding up the letter. "What does this mean? What are you hiding?" For a moment, she seemed completely speechless. Her eyes fixed on the letter, and her face went pale. This wasn't shock. It was fear mixed with resignation. After a few tense moments of silence, she finally spoke. But it wasn't the answer I expected. Instead of clarifying things, she gave me a weak excuse. "That has nothing to do with you. It's something from many years ago and doesn't affect your family." I wasn't buying it. Her trembling voice and refusal to meet my gaze only confirmed that she was lying. I pushed further. "Who was Alfonso R? Why was he writing to you? And how is this tied to the crime I uncovered?" My last question hit a nerve. She began to fidget, muttering something incoherent. Finally, she collapsed onto the couch and, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, started to talk. What she told me left me completely stunned. Decades ago, Alfonso R. hadn't just been an acquaintance. he had been her lover. According to her, their relationship started long before she met the man who would later become her husband. Alfonso, she said, was charming but dangerous, someone who lived life on the edge of the law. When she became pregnant, she decided to hide the child, her daughter, my wife, from Alfonso and cut off all contact with him. But years later, Alfonso reappeared in her life. By then, he was on the run from authorities, wanted for a multimillion-dollar robbery and a murder. He begged her for help, not just to hide him, but also to protect something he called his legacy. My mother-in-law refused to elaborate, but it became clear this legacy was part of the stolen loot. He buried it, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, on a property that belonged to my family. No one has found it yet. Suddenly, everything clicked. My mother-in-law's obsession with the DNA test had nothing to do with paranoia or control. Her real fear was that this situation might somehow expose her connection to Alfonso and the crime she'd been hiding for decades. I was utterly floored. My mother-in-law hadn't just lied about her past. She had manipulated the entire family to keep her secret buried, both literally and figuratively. And now I held the key to unraveling it all. Before leaving, I made one thing clear. I wasn't going to stay silent. If this comes out, it'll be because you put yourself in this position, I told her. For the first time, I saw something in her I'd never seen before. Genuine panic. That night, as I tried to process everything I had learned, I realized there was no turning back. I had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and whatever lay on the other side was about to change the family forever. After my confrontation with my mother-in-law, something shifted in me. It wasn't just curiosity or indignation driving me anymore. It was the need to expose the truth, to uncover everything this woman had buried, both literally and figuratively. I couldn't let her keep manipulating everyone, but I also knew I had to tread carefully. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. There was a crime involved, and the puzzle pieces pointed to something far more serious. I realized I couldn't handle this alone. I needed someone who could help me connect the dots without alerting my mother-in-law. That's when I remembered the email from the old family acquaintance who had warned me about her. I replied, explaining what I had found and asking for any additional information. I didn't expect much, but the response I received was a bombshell. Your mother-in-law has always been involved in shady dealings. Alfonso wasn't just her lover, he was her partner in some questionable business ventures. The last time anyone heard of him was right before the crime you mentioned. Everyone in the family suspected she knew more than she let on, but we never had proof. Be careful. If you confront her, make sure you're prepared. That warning confirmed my worst fears. My mother-in-law wasn't some victim of circumstance, as she had tried to portray herself. She was an active participant, someone who had played a key role in protecting a man wanted for murder and robbery. And now, it was clear that she had spent decades manipulating the family to keep that secret safe. I decided it was time to reveal everything, not just to my wife, but to the entire family. If my mother-in-law had built her castle of lies over years of deceit, exposing her publicly was the only way to bring it crashing down. I chose the setting carefully, a family gathering. It was the perfect stage, with everyone present and no chance for her to escape the questions. I arrived early, with all the evidence in hand. Alfonso's letter, the documents I had found in her office, and the records connecting Alfonso to the crime. I didn't know how everyone would react, but I was ready to face whatever came next. When my mother-in-law arrived, she acted as if nothing was wrong, wearing her usual mask of control and smiling at everyone as though she were the perfect host. But as I watched her sit at the head of the table, where she always liked to be, I knew it was time. I stood up and called for everyone's attention. I have something important to share, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't back down now. For years, this family has lived under certain rules, always dictated by certain people. I began, looking directly at my mother-in-law. But there are things that have been hidden, secrets that have put all of us at risk. She tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. I placed Alfonso's letter on the table. Do you recognize this? I asked. Her face went pale. I laid everything out. Alfonso's connection to the crime, his relationship with her, and how she had used the family as a shield to protect herself. Every word felt like a blow, not just to her, but to everyone at the table. My wife sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Other family members began murmuring, clearly torn between disbelief and horror. The final nail in the coffin was when I presented the documents suggesting that the stolen loot was buried on a family property. "This isn't just a secret," I said gravely. "It's a crime, and we've all been unknowingly used to cover it up." My mother-in-law finally broke her silence, but not to defend herself. She screamed, cried, and tried to justify her actions, claiming she had done it for the good of the family. But no one was listening. Her words fell on deaf ears, and for the first time, I saw the woman who had always been in control completely unravel. The gathering ended in chaos. My wife, devastated, left the house without saying a word. Other family members began arguing, some demanding explanations, others simply walking away in disgust. As for me, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The truth was out, but I knew this was just the beginning. That same night, I decided to contact the authorities. I knew Alfonso R.'s case was still open, and I had enough evidence to reignite the investigation. My mother-in-law had manipulated everyone for far too long, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. Exposing my mother-in-law in front of the entire family was a temporary relief, but the sense that something bigger was looming didn't leave me. I knew this wasn't going to end with a simple family argument. This wasn't just a secret coming to light. It was a crime that had been buried for decades. Now all eyes were on me for starting this storm. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained but determined. The night before, I had contacted the authorities and handed over all the evidence. Alfonso's letter, the records linking him to the robbery and murder, and the documents showing my mother-in-law's connection to him. I knew this was just the beginning of a long investigation, but at least I had taken the first step. What happened next, though, was beyond anything I expected. That afternoon, I received a call from one of the investigators handling the case. They informed me that Alfonso R.'s case had officially been reopened and that the evidence I provided was enough to justify a search of the property mentioned in my mother-in-law's documents. I was stunned. I had always thought this was just a family scandal, a dark drama that, while messy, would remain contained within our circle. But now it had become a legal matter, a high-profile case that would soon attract public attention. A few days later, the search began. Authorities, armed with a warrant, combed through the family property mentioned in the documents. My wife and I watched, along with several other family members, including my mother-in-law. As the officers dug through the site, she sat silently, her expression oscillating between anger and fear. It didn't take long for them to find what they were looking for. In a remote corner of the property, buried beneath layers of dirt and debris, they uncovered a metal box. Inside, they found gold bars, jewelry, and stacks of cash. But the most chilling discovery was a weapon, a rusted pistol that, according to the investigators, matched the description of the gun used in the murder Alfonso was accused of. The revelation sent shockwaves through the family. As the officers processed the evidence, my mother-in-law finally broke her silence. She screamed, denied everything, and insisted she knew nothing about the stash. But the evidence was damning. The documents, the letter, and even some of the items found in the box all pointed to her complicity in hiding the loot, and by extension, her involvement in the crime. That same evening, my mother-in-law was arrested. Watching the woman who had controlled and manipulated our family for so long being handcuffed and taken away was surreal. I didn't feel joy or triumph, just a strange mix of relief and sadness. No matter how much harm she had caused, she was still my wife's mother and my son's grandmother. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. My wife, understandably devastated, struggled to come to terms with the reality of what her mother had done. Some family members blamed us for bringing everything to light, while others thanked us for finally putting an end to the lies. As the months went on, my mother-in-law's case became a public spectacle. The investigation uncovered even darker details about her relationship with Alfonso and how she had used her position in the family to cover up the crime for decades. Alfonso, of course, was still missing, but with the new evidence, authorities were closer than ever to tracking him down. As for us, my wife and I decided it was time to start fresh. We moved far from the city, leaving behind the family home and all the weight of its memories. It was a difficult decision, but we knew it was the best one for us and, most importantly, for our son. This chapter of our lives, though painful and full of betrayal, taught us something invaluable: the importance of truth, no matter how uncomfortable or painful it may be. Because in the end, truth is the only thing that can free us from the chains of the past. And so, I closed this chapter of my life, carrying the scars of what had happened, but also the certainty that I had done the right thing. The truth had come to light, and while the family would never be the same, at least now we could build something real on the foundation of honesty. If you found my story captivating, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more personal and dramatic stories like this one. Your support means the world to me.